So this week there's been a variety of discussions on the role of markets and market mechanisms. And those discussions include the functioning of markets that already exist under the Kyoto Protocol, namely the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, and Joint Implementation, JI. And it's also included discussions on the role of markets and market architecture after the Kyoto Protocol's second commitment period. So what is called the framework for various approaches and the new market mechanism, along with non-market approaches. For both discussions, mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol and market architecture for the post-2020 climate policy context, governments here in Lima were not able to come to consensus on how those discussions can continue to move forward. So that doesn't mean that carbon markets are dead or this process doesn't recognize the importance of them. It just means that under a technical discussion amongst governments, there wasn't a consensus on how to continue that discussion here in Lima. So those discussions will continue in June next year in Bonn. And we might still see before this COP is over, the ADP, which is the body responsible for negotiating the 2015 agreement, may very well have elements in its draft text coming out of Lima that recognize the importance of carbon markets and the fact that many countries are going to be utilizing carbon markets to meet their commitments after 2020. And this has to be in the agreement and in the decisions from Lima because we've come to Lima after a World Bank carbon pricing statement, which has over 73 governments which have signed on to it and over 1,000 companies. So this process has to recognize the importance of carbon pricing. It has to recognize the importance of carbon markets because many governments are going to use carbon markets to meet their commitments. And it has to come to a decision on how market architecture can be developed so countries can start to reduce emissions immediately.
But is there not some quite stiff ideological opposition to carbon markets, both from many countries in this part of the world and also, it seems, from many in civil society? So what's your sort of idea about how that sort of ideological battle can be resolved?
I think carbon markets are a transitional policy tool. They are not, to quote the Executive Secretary, Cristiana Figueres, an end in of themselves. But they are definitely a policy approach that many governments want to utilize to meet their commitments. Countries voluntarily use carbon markets. This process isn't imposing the use of carbon markets on any one country at all. So in a world of bottom-up pledges where countries are going to decide nationally what kind of approaches they're going to utilize, some will utilize carbon markets and others may not. But there shouldn't be a convention that precludes the use and function of carbon markets and of those carbon markets being used by more than one country. Countries should be able to link their markets with each other as well, because recent research from the Harvard University's Project on Climate Agreements shows us that linkages of heterogeneous and homogeneous carbon policy instruments will lead to more ambitious policies and more cost-effective policies for the actual users of those systems. So whether or not there are ideological opposition to carbon markets, nobody should leave Lima thinking carbon markets are being forced on them. But this process should recognize the importance of them and recognize the fact that many countries plan to utilize them to meet their commitments.